is there's a common understanding in public culture in America and internationally that if there's a science problem, you need a scientist to solve it. But I want to get into the details of the report here, but essentially that is the wrong way of thinking about it. Scientists have known what was going on since like 1950. They are not going to solve it. It's a political problem.
Right.
There's no like numbers going the wrong way or anything. We saw this coming a mile away.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. And like, so there have been individual scientists who have studied the problem for a really long time and who have been like raising alarm bells for a really long time. But it wasn't until the 90s, like late 80s, early 90s, when it started to become enough of a problem that people were like, okay, we need to actually start building scientific consensus around this and like pulling from all of the different fields together and connecting it to the possibility for policymaking around it, because there was the ozone holes that were happening, like this other big global problem. And people basically were like, we need to identify a way to utilize the science to create policy solutions. But in order to do that, we have to have a sort of scientific consensus that is apolitical. And so they worked at the UN level to create the UN Framework on Climate Change and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. So that's what you might see on Twitter when you see things like IPCC report is trending. That's the body within the UN or adjacent to the UN that is gathering all of these reports. There's tens of thousands of scientific reports that go into every single one of these synthesis reports that is put out by the IPCC. So this latest one, basically this is the 6th IPCC synthesis report. And since they've started doing that in the mid 90s. And so this report that just came out on Monday is the first working group, which is the like basis for the physical science around climate change. And it's an update on that consensus around what is causing climate change and like how bad it is and what the effects are and that sort of thing.
Right. It's weird if you're plugged into this kinds of stuff because, we get this big report that comes out and it confirms a lot of the things you're already worried about. But the real breakthrough in the science here is every country on Earth signs on to this thing. And like the big development is, okay, we all agree it's man-made now for sure. Before we were only 98% sure, but now we're 99.3% sure.
Yeah, totally. I think the language in the last report was like, we are reasonably sure that it's man-made, and now it's unequivocally sure that climate change is man-made. It's, this is the sort of thing that when we're building the climate science, they quibble over these words. And then the same thing ends up happening with the political solutions too, like the Paris Agreement. The words go back and forth, and people will never sign on to reports that actually have binding solutions. And then they'll create days and days and days of essentially stalling. That's why a climate agreement failed in 2009 in Copenhagen. And that's why the one in 2015 in Paris isn't actually binding to anything, because the US and other powerful nations were like, well, we're not going to hold ourselves accountable, and we refuse to sign on to this if it has any words in it, like individual words that might make it seem like we might be held accountable.
I don't want to feel scared. I don't want the report to scare me.
So what did it entail when Biden rejoined the Paris Accords? I mean, does it really mean anything?
Yeah, totally. So, the process around the Paris Agreement and the International Climate Accords are super important. They are completely inadequate. But to me, they are important because they are the one venue where we have both like those with decision-making power and also civil society and scientists coming together across countries to start that dialogue of what it is going to take to solve climate change, because it is going to be like a global solution that has to happen. So in the way that like the UN is totally inadequate and always has been, and it has always been in some ways gamed by powerful nations like the US. But then also there have been countries like Cuba and leaders like other folks who like go into that space and say there is potential here. In that same way, I think we have to recognize the fact that like we could hold people accountable through that framework. And basically everybody, when they signed on to the Paris Accord, they created what was called a nationally determined contribution, an NDC, that was saying this is how much carbon emissions we are going to commit to reducing by X time. And then all of those things together created the Paris Agreement. And so then the IPCC and other policymakers and also other scientists sort of have a baseline to measure. Here's where the science says we're going, and here's where the nationally determined contributions are if they get met 100%. And then the gap between those, that's how much faster we have to be going in order to get to the science. So in theory, they could do that without making policy recommendations.